Curious Lloyd.
History is long and full of dark, terrible events, but with things that should never be forgotten. That's why every other street in Berlin has a statue or plaque that shouts out to every passerby. But sometimes, we don't want to remember, and that's how ice cream shops and schools get built over remains of evil deeds. So here are some unremarkable places that are definitely haunted. A small playground covers Hitler's suicide bunker. At first glance, this looks like another run-of-the-mill playground near a car park. It has a sand pit, a few benches, and a slide that looks like a surprise alligator drawn by Salvador Dali, until you find out the horror it hides. So dig a little deeper, and you'll find a few feet underneath this little Berlin park lies the extensive bunker where Adolf Hitler offed himself at the end of World War II. But also, that slide is right atop of the crater where Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies were burnt, so you could say that is pretty eerie. The bunker is situated a little over 200 yards from the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and while historians never forget where it was, they were pretty hesitant to let anyone else know. The German state only publicly identified it as Hitler's bunker in 2006, as there was a genuine fear that right-wing extremists might flock up to the place. But Hitler's half-busted bunker is now sealed and buried below a car park of an apartment building, and the playground has been built on top. There's still Nazi graffiti everywhere, but every bit of black fascist tagging gets meticulously crossed over with vibrant blue anti-Nazi graffiti. A Chicago post office is built on the bones of the first American serial killer's victims. This is Englewood Post Office in Chicago. This is the place where your mail gets sorted if you live in the 60621 postcode. But before it became a post office, this Chicago block was once the site of H.H. Holmes' murder castle. The reality is much more freakier. H.H. Holmes, which is no relation to the detective, but was a typical business owner. When he arrived in Chicago in 1887, Holmes was able to cheaply purchase a drugstore in Englewood, whose owner happened to have vanished around the same time he showed up. Over the next few years, he set out to acquire more buildings on his block until he was able to rebuild all of it into the castle. It was named the Castle for its distinctive style. Holmes started renting out the rooms in his castle just around the time the 1893 World's Fair started, which saw a massive influx of tourists and other people whom nobody would notice if they went missing. As it turned out, that's exactly what would happen to many of them after a brief spell in the castle. Residents quickly discovered that while the outside looked all elegant and spacious, the interior housed poorly lit rooms with weird angles, secret chambers, and dead-end corridors. Holmes had designed his own Saw-like funhouse torture dungeon, replete with trapdoors, poison gas vents, and greased shafts leading to the basement. The basement was where Holmes had his killer toys, like an acid tank, a surgery table, and what he allegedly called an elastic determinator, or a torture rag he used to create a failed race of freakishly tall people. In 1884, after a banner year of bloodshed, Holmes was arrested for insurance fraud. But then, some smart detective remembered that he had an intriguing building full of cool secret passages that were probably worth exploring. After the bodies were found, Holmes confessed immediately. According to the killer himself, he was responsible for 27 gruesome murders, but according to the press, there were probably hundreds of bodies unaccounted for. However, recent experts have stated that the number of victims was probably only around a dozen or so, most of them from his former employees. But whatever the reality, the legendary murder castle stood there until 1938, when it was torn down to build a post office, which sounds even more unpleasant to visit than the murder castle. Al Capone's most famous execution spot is now nursing a home car park. This is a nursing home car park on Clark Street near Dickens in Chicago. If that place sounds vaguely familiar, but you can't quite put a finger on it, I shall explain the following. So the horror this place hides is the site of the Valentines Day Massacre, where Al Capone ordered one of the worst violent episodes of the Prohibition era. Set up as a lucrative whiskey deal, rival Bugs Moran's boys were led into a warehouse at the corner of Dickinson's and Clark, Dressed like Chicago cops, Capone's men popped up and arrested 6 mobsters and 1 poor randomer bystander. Thinking it was a routine pat-down, they lined themselves up against the garage wall, at which point machine gun bullets started flying, which gruesomely executed the 7 unarmed men. The bloodied wall became such a symbol for the violence happening in Chicago that a lot of citizens regarded it as bad luck. As with most of the blood-stained objects, it did not take long for the owners to just demolish the entire warehouse. However, a Canadian bar owner secretly bought the bricks and reassembled the wall into his men's room. He covered it with protective glass, painted targets over where the people were shot, and in order to get the toilet to flush, you had to pee on the target. The bar eventually closed, and though some of the wall's individual bricks were sold to collectors, most of the wall now sits in the mob's museum in Las Vegas. Because where else would you build a museum to organise crime? But the car park itself maintains no memorial or anything to this horrific event. The creator of Full House lives on the site of the Manson murders. La Villa Bel Air is one of the hottest properties in the Benedict Canyon, LA. The $6 million Mediterranean-style home has 9 bedrooms, a wine cellar, a screening room, an elevator, a tennis court, an infinity pool, and a spa. You probably can't even afford to look at it, but as I've mentioned before in my previous Manson murder documentary, it hides a certain horror. La Villa Bel Air is distinct from its neighbouring houses, as it was built from the ground up in the mid-90s. That's because the owner had to destroy the previous mansion when he found out that no one wanted to buy the house where the Manson family murdered Shannon Tate and 4 other people. So oddly enough, that doesn't look good on a property listing. In fact, the only person owner, Alwyn Trabb, found after listing the property was Trent 9 Inch Nails Reznor, who leased the mansion and built a recording studio inside for his album, The Downward Spiral. After that, Wintrab found it almost impossible to sell the famous murder house in California, so he decided to tear it down and start over. When Reznor found out his former house was a piece of murder history was going to be bulldozed, he stole the door as a souvenir. After building La Villa Bel Air on top of the cursed remnants of the Polanski's house, Weintraub performed the LA equivalent of a spiritual cleansing. He sold the mansion to Jeff Franklin, creator of Full House and producer of Stuart Little, probably hoping his wholesomeness could drive out the last lingering traces of one of Hollywood's darkest chapters. The Salem witch trials happened behind a Walgreens. This is Walgreens. The trials were responsible for the executions of 20 citizens who weren't good enough in the eyes of some Puritan people. As a punishment for not knowing the difference between tarragon and rosemary, most of them were executed by hanging at a spot called Gallows Hill. Ironically, given its distinctive name, for centuries, no one knew where the place actually was. The pilgrims hadn't bothered recording or even making the location of Gallows Hill. At the time, it was probably hard to miss, what with their neighbours hanging from a tree over there. But luckily, some historians from the Salem state did some digging and came to a weird discovery, working off the notes of an old-time lawyer, who was Sidney Purley. The team traced Gallows Hill to an overgrown area behind their local Walgreens, where a group of homeless people were living. There is a ledge called Proctor's Ledge that could be seen for miles, and according to Professor Emerson Baker of Salem State, it made perfect sense for public executions and ghost sightings of the wrongly executed. It took 3 centuries to rediscover the notorious site does not exactly speak well for the Salem's dictation to history. But this wasn't exactly an oversight. Professor Baker also uncovered that the city had purchased Gallows Hill in 1936 and left it unused. They purchased this specifically to be a memorial place for the witches. So in reality, the city was more keen on keeping its sordid past as murky as possible and let the site go derelict.